talk a lot about encountering Christ, but but for the most part, that conversation isn't a conversation about spending time in adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. For the most part, when we talk as Christians about encountering Christ, we're talking about living out that encounter in the concrete human moments of our lives, living out that encounter with the poor, living out that encounter with a spouse or a child or someone who's sick. Pope Francis has invited us to focus on the marginalized as we look for this encounter. You might remember once I recounted a story from Blaise Pascal's sister. Blaise Pascal was a philosopher and a mathematician, French philosopher and mathematician, and as he was dying, he wasn't able to receive viaticum, communion, for the last time. His health was such that he couldn't keep down the food, and the priest came on a few occasions, but determined each time that he couldn't receive. And so finally, according to his sister, Blaise Pascal finally said, would just bring me a homeless person to be with me here in my room so that I can die in the presence of Christ. That's the kind of encounter that we talk about. But today's story that Jesus tells of this Samaritan, of the traveler on the road to Jericho, and the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan who come across him. In so many ways, it's the story of why, even though it's easy to talk about this kind of encounter, living it is quite challenging. And in some ways, Jesus explores with this lawyer what is difficult about encountering our neighbor as Christ. We read it with different eyes, the story, right? We see this hero of a Samaritan, and we've named all of our hospitals and some of our laws after the Samaritan, right? And it's quite the shift, because nobody would have heard Jesus saying that. The Samaritan was a semi-pagan enemy of Israel who lived in the heart of Israel. Some of the tribes that had gotten lost along the way. That uncle that you don't dare let your family spend any meaningful time with because he's gone off track. And there's a little bit of turf too. If you remember, Luke had already told us that Jesus wasn't welcomed in Samaria on his way to Jerusalem. And you can be sure that Samaritans weren't welcomed in Jericho. And in fact, if anyone had a reason to mind his own business, the Samaritan, who was already a target, and if he was seen too close to the victim, would also be the most likely suspect. And yet, in spite of it all, he's able to encounter the things that block his encounter with this man, with Christ, on the side of the road. They're not so big as to stop the encounter. But look, the priest, his is, right? Probably on the way up to offer a temple sacrifice. And it's very important to him that he not become ritually unclean by coming into contact with human blood, by coming into contact with maybe a cadaver. And so everybody would have understood that as an act of precaution, it was reasonable for him to walk on the other side of the road, to keep his 4 cubits of distance so that he could go and offer a temple sacrifice. And those are the kinds of obstacles to encounter that stand most painfully, most dangerously in the way for us. The ones that everybody, like we in hindsight, we think, oh, what a horrible religious leader. What a hypocrite, right? But that wasn't the point of the story. What he was a cautious observer of religious law. But love trumps law. And Jesus would invite us into those encounters where love has a chance to shine. And we're inclined to that, right? It's written on our hearts. Moses already had experienced that teaching from God, and we know it, that this law to love our neighbors is written on our hearts, and people are trying to take advantage of that all the time and get in front of our eyes, either in the news or some cause that will cause us to open our hearts. But the other obstacle, maybe the lawyer's obstacle, was one of a certain kind of selfishness. We desperately want to help those who are in need within our credit limit. Right? We want to help those who are in need insofar as it doesn't change the quality of my life. We would be happy to provide food for someone who's hungry as long as there's still enough food, enough money to buy the nice food that I want for my family. And thus all of these different competitive causes vying for our attention, hoping to get our budgeted philanthropic dollars. But the budget stands in the way of encounter. Or maybe we put budget in the way of encounter so that we don't risk being too powerfully affected in a way that would upset our lives. But the Samaritan's life was upset, and he was forever changed. And even if he was a semi-pagan, and even if he was a traitor to Judaism, Jesus says he's the hero of this story because he allowed himself to enter into an encounter that led not to some kind of care, but to love. He allowed himself to be overwhelmed with compassion that led him to love. And day by day, I reflect on my own life and see the ways that God invites me to the same, and see the ways that I've found some good reason to walk on the other side of the street, and have lost out on those encounters with love, with God, that would completely transform my life. I'm going to work on that, and I invite you to do the same.